let up just because we have a fewer amount of people. So,
Bring it on.
are you ready for full guns?
We're ready. Yeah. We're ready.
Exodus.
We're ready.
Where were you?
I was ready.
You
I was
just
getting
got
ready.
church?
I was getting ready.
Exodus chapter 3, beginning with verse 1.
We're ready.
Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn. So when the Lord saw that, he turned aside to look. God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Here's Moses. He's out taking care of the sheep, and he sees this bush on fire, and the bush wasn't burning up. Then Moses turned to get a better look at the bush. You know, if it was me, I'd say he turned and got his curiosity was up as to what's going on. How can this bush be burning and not be consumed out here in the middle of the desert? So instead of passing by, he stops to check things out. And here's what caught my eye. When God saw that Moses turned to check things out, God noticed. Moses stopped and took a good look. And God noticed that. God paid attention to Moses' reaction. Makes you want to stop and think, doesn't it? What you're doing in life, as you're going about your normal life, is God noticing what's going on? And is that what you're wanting to notice? So here's a question for you as we get going here. Have you ever had a burning bush experience in your life? Has God ever done something drastic to get your attention?
Amen.
Now, two questions. I just want you to be thinking about those two questions. And then I'm going to go back in time and give you some background on this scripture. And you might remember the whole story of Moses. Moses was born at a pretty bad time. All the newborn male Hebrew children were to be put to death. And his mom didn't have the heart to do that, so she put him in a basket and hid him in the bushes. And I'm going to leave the rest of that story to your imagination at that point. But he was found by Pharaoh's daughter. He was raised in the palace. And as he grew up, he knew that he was a Hebrew. He knew his people were being held captive by the Egyptians. They were slaves to the Egyptians. And one day, he saw one of his people, one of the Hebrew people, being mistreated in a bad way, and his anger just welled up inside of him, and he killed the guy for doing it. And the short story of this incident is he got found out, and he had to flee for his life. Now, let's fast forward to just before the scripture that I read this morning. Have you ever just sat down convenient this is here this morning, isn't it? Have you ever just sat down and thought about life? Thought about the experiences you've had in your life? I could just picture Moses doing that as he's on the backside of the desert. Here he is in the desert. It's another day. Probably a boring day. How exciting could it be just taking care of a bunch of sheep? All they do is eat. You're going to help me here. Drink and thank you. One of you would help me here. All they do is eat, drink, and sleep. And I think his mind just started to wander. Here's Moses. He grew up in the palace. He had lived as royalty. And now he's no longer a prince, but a poor shepherd. Barely getting by. And I'm sure he had everything that he needed, but it just wasn't like living in the palace. And I'm sure his mind went back and he thought about his fellow Hebrew people. They're still being held captive. They're still slaves in Egypt. How he must have thought and longed to see his people set free. But then again, thinking, what can I do? I'm only one person. I don't have the ability to go set them free. And also that he's never going to live in the palace again. He's never going to have that prestige. He's never going to be esteemed like that again. Did he miss that life? I don't know. But I can't help but think that Moses knew he was where he needed to be. And as he is thinking about these things, again I wonder, was he thinking, is this where I'm going to spend the rest of my life? Am I going to keep being a shepherd the rest of my life? Is that all there is to life? Or does God have some kind of a plan for me that I just don't know what it is? Keep in mind I'm wandering here. The life of Moses. How many of you can relate to those thoughts of Moses? Am I going to be in Garberville the rest of my life? Am I going to work at the grocery store until I die? Or the lumberyard? Or the campground? Is that all I've got to do in life? Am I going to keep living where I am? Doing what I'm doing? Or does God have something else in mind for me? Does God have a plan? You heard the scripture last week, and you've heard it many times before from me. Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the thoughts that I think toward you, says the Lord. Thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you a future and a hope. That's God's plan for you. He's got a future. He's got hope. He's given you those things. Now, of all of these thoughts I've shared with you about Moses, all those things he may have been thinking about, after all, he was human just like you and I are. Have you ever wondered why God has you where you are?
Yes, sir.
As I was thinking about it, I thought, in the last few months, there's been 4 people from our church that's had surgery. Actually, in the last 4 weeks. 2 people from our church have lost loved ones. 1 that I know of has had a financial setback. And many other things going on in their lives. God, is that what you've got for us? And you think, God, why? God, what's going on? Is there a plan for me in my life? Moses had 40 years in the palace. And then Moses had 40 years as a shepherd on the backside of the desert. Now what? God, what's taking you so long? You know, we're people that don't have a lot of patience, right? I take that those of you that responded don't have much patience. We want patience. We want answers now. God, I want patience and I want it now. Thank you. God, whatever you have for my life, tell me now. Show me now. So here's Moses walking around, walking with his flock, and suddenly, unexpectedly, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire in the midst of the bush. And there it was. Can you picture you're walking around in the desert and you look up and there's this bush burning? What would your response be? Glowing with the power of God. Whatever the reason that God appeared in the burning bush, it served the purpose of getting his attention. Have you ever had, guys, and then ladies, you can think of it in your other side too, but have you ever had a conversation with your wife, or ladies with your husband, and she says, what do you think about that? And then you hesitate for a moment. You realize you have no idea what the last thing she said was. And if you're like me, you smile. And you nod. And you hope that's going to get you through. And then she says, you don't know what I just said, do you? And then I realized that she was communicating with me, and I missed the communication. That can happen between God and us. Let me tell you. He may be speaking to you, and he says, what do you think about that? I don't know, God. What was that? We can sometimes be oblivious to the fact that God is talking to us and we miss what he's saying. God speaking to us could be like Moses in the burning bush. The bush was on fire, but Moses had to turn and to see and to check it out, to receive the message. The bush was burning. Whether or not Moses paid attention, God put the bush in his path. But Moses had to choose to pay attention. Have you ever read a scripture? And then a friend has a conversation with you that's similar to what you just read? Yeah? Or maybe you've heard a sermon then things happen to you that you say, I just heard that. Wow. God, what's going on here? God has many ways to get our attention. God even used a donkey to speak to Balaam. To get Balaam's attention. God, I trust you don't have to do that to me. Please, not a donkey. But once God had his attention, he said, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. And then God began to speak. And God said, don't come near to this bush, but take your shoes off. For the place where you stand is holy ground. The significance of taking the sandals off was a confession of his unworthiness. You may feel like where I am, our unworthiness. You may feel like where I am, just little old me. No one's ever going to notice me. Let me tell you, God knew right where Moses was on the backside of the desert. God knows right where you are, where it might feel like the backside of nowhere. God knew the concerns that Moses had about his friends and his people. God knows what you are going through, and he has heard your prayers. God was preparing Moses all these years to do a job. When God told him what it was, he said, I can't do that. God has been preparing you for a job to be done, something bigger, something more important. What's your response going to be? When God told Moses that the job was, or what the job was, he said, but I'm not worthy. I think how amazing it is how God used Moses. Some of you may not think of things quite this way with Moses, but this really stood out to me this time around when God used Moses. God used a killer. With an anger problem. Now, we may not have killers in here, but we have people that have anger problems.
Yeah, we do.
I had somebody call me this past week. Maybe it was 2 weeks ago. He says, Pastor, now, I'm not going to tell you all the conversation, but at the, before we, well, it was the end of the conversation, he hung up on me. He didn't want to hear what I had to say. I called him back.
Amen.
He says, listen, you asked for advice. I'm sharing with you what God told me to share with you. Now, you want to still have an attitude? You still want to cop an attitude? Anger problems. I says, God's going to work with you on that problem before he can help you through on the other problem that you want me to help you with. What God told Moses, what the job was. Like I said, he says, I'm not worthy. But he also said, God, I don't know how to talk. So God used Moses killer with an anger problem. Think about how amazing God is. Every one of us is unholy and unworthy, and God still wants to use us. Let me ask again. Have you ever had a burning bush experience in your life? That experience when God is trying to get your attention. And He got your attention and is stuck with you all your life. Or are you the person that God, you had a burning bush experience and you've let it fade away in your life? And you've forgotten about what God has done for you and what God has helped you with. And you need to have another burning bush experience in your life. Is that burning bush experience still burning inside, or has that fire gone out? I like this. You are just an ordinary person. And it might be just an ordinary day. But God is an extraordinary God. And He knows how to get your attention. Are you listening for His voice? Is God speaking to you, and are you listening to what He's got to tell you? God has done many things in my life where I've had those experiences that so many of them just come to me even right now as we're talking. Stick with you. Stick with you. We're still talking about that burning bush experience of Moses, even today, from thousands of years ago. Amen. Think about it. Heavenly Father, this congregation has a desire to hear from you, to hear what you have to tell them, Lord. I believe that with all my heart. And God, I pray that as you speak, we listen. And that not only do we listen, but we put things into action for what you have laid on our hearts. And I thank you for that, Lord. Amen. I tell you, God's good.
All the time.
All the time.
Right.
Yeah. Just stand with me.